Okay, so today I am going to redo the pattern making demo that we did in Thursday's class. I feel like it wasn't very clear on some of the instructions, so I'm gonna redo those right now. So what we'll need is your utility knife or scissors if you prefer. I have this little sewing awl here. You could also use your utility blade. You really just need something pointy so that you can hold this in place and spin it around. And of course, your pencil. So, as we've done before, we're gonna start by tracing this mean form. Okay. And again, I am going to be designing a very simple loafer. So as I trace this, I'm gonna reference my ball point, my vamp point, my counterpoint. I'm gonna use this awl to poke a hole at the quarter point, right? Then I'll use my straight edge to connect those points. Okay? All right, so I'm gonna measure that 4 millimeters here. Right? Just so happens to be really close to my quarter point here. I'm gonna mark that there. Mark that here. And then mark that here. And I'll use my straight edge to connect those dots. Like so. All right, so as you can see, it's starting to take shape, right? So you have this quarter line, which will be the top of my quarter, right? And then you're starting to design this tongue here. Now, considering this is a loafer, I need to decide where I want my instep to begin, right? So how high do I want this tongue to go? Again, this is a loafer, so it doesn't really matter. I can make this a really long tongue, which might look a little weird. I can make this a shorter tongue. I can do no tongue at all and have just a sort of a radius here, and it'll be more of a court shoe than a loafer. But these design choices are up to you. You can do as you like. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna say, I don't know, how about 5 millimeters, right? So from that vamp point, I'm gonna measure up 5 centimeters. I'm sorry. Sometimes I say centimeters when I mean millimeters. That's a problem. Okay. And then I'm gonna do another line perpendicular from this cone line here. All right. There we have it. That is half of our tongue right there. Now, you can use a circle template or a French curve to sort of design this and make this much nicer, right? Or you can do something really weird. Maybe it's some kind of squiggly line here, and then you would do the same in this area here, right? I'm just gonna keep it simple and do a really basic curve. So we talk about the vamp point a lot, and I think it's important to understand that the vamp point is the area of the foot that bends when we walk, right? So it's this area here that will eventually develop like sort of like creases, right? So that is something that you should keep in mind when you're designing. Maybe you want to avoid some really intricate design in this area because it's going to have creases, or maybe you want to design something here that will help prevent those creases. That is totally up to you. So I'm just going to put a second radius here. All right. I'm going to call that my loafer. So now, before I add my seam allowances and your folding allowances and your lasting allowances, I'm going to cut this out. Right, I'm going to cut out the pattern of the loafer here. Again, you can use your knife, X-Acto, or scissors, whatever you're more comfortable with. So that is what I'm left with. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I am going to spring this toe, right? Because what has to happen is, because this is gonna be a symmetrical pattern and this is only half of the pattern, I want this to be a straight edge so that I can fold it along a sheet of paper, cut it out, and then open it up, and it'll be the same mirrored shape. But I can't do that if this edge is curved. So I need this to become a straight line. And this is how we make this a straight line. So I'm gonna take the cutout that we just did, I'm gonna trace it. Okay, so I got everything. I'm gonna make sure I get the vent point, ball point, counterpoint is the top of this, so that doesn't necessarily need to be here. But then I'm gonna find the quarter point here, and I'm gonna put my sewing awl. If you don't have a sewing awl, you can use the very point of your X-Acto or utility knife. All right, and make sure that you can rotate this here. Before you rotate this, you need to draw a straight line, right? So you line up the straight part of your vamp. And I understand that some of you, this sort of area here doesn't have a very pronounced curve. It's fairly straight as it is, which means that you'll just have to do less work. So lucky you. But in my case, I have a fairly pronounced curve here, so I need to get rid of that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna align this with the straight part of my vamp and then draw a line along there. I want this line to extend, you know, beyond the instep point here, right? So there you go, there's our line going straight through, right? Don't worry about the curve here on the toe, that's not a problem. Just make sure that your line is straight here on the vamp and goes through. So with that, we're gonna put our cutout back in place, take our awl, put it at that pivot point, right, which is also your quarter point, and we're gonna rotate that form until this point here. Can you see that? Yeah, so this is the original point. We're gonna rotate it until it aligns with that line, right? And what that does is that makes this pattern straight across here. So now what you're gonna do is, right, so here, this line's kind of faint, so I'm gonna trace over it. So this is the original edge of the form before we rotated it, right? As you can see, over on this end here, you have that much difference, right, due to the rotation. And what we're gonna do, we're just gonna trace, starting at the vamp point here. We're gonna trace this new edge, right? I should have done this in another color so you can see the difference, but I'll just trace over there in a second. Okay, so now you have this new edge. And I'm sorry, my pencil is not very sharp. Okay, so I just cleaned up that line a little bit. Now I'll take this red pencil to trace the new shape. And then when I get to this point here, I'm just gonna sort of true it and find a nice radius here. Keeping in mind that, you know, this will be the center line here. Right, and you don't really want this to come to a really point, so kind of ease that curve a little bit so it's nice and rounded. Okay? So there you have it, there's your new shape. Right, there's the original pattern there. Maybe it'll be easier to see like this. That's the original pattern. And then we adjusted it, rotated it. So now that we have that straight line across the top here. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut this out because I'll need a larger sheet of paper, or I'll have to tape 2 sheets of paper together so that I can trace it again and then unfold it, and you'll have one piece. All right. And then I'm gonna fold it along that line. Actually, I'm gonna fold it this way. Then I'll trace this form onto the doubled sheet of paper, or folded sheet of paper. Okay. Now before I continue sort of drafting my pattern, what I want to do is I'm going to take this piece, right? That's the piece that we just traced here. I'm going to crumble it up. Right? And if you remember, the reason we crumbled up paper is to make it a little more malleable. Right? And of course, uncrumble it. Careful so you don't tear it. And then I'm going to lay this onto my last just to sort of check my work and see how I'm going before I continue down this path. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my counterpoint and the heel here. Put a little bit of tape there just to hold it temporarily. You may not be able to see it, but there's a line here so that I can line up my center line. Jeez. Okay, so then I'm just gonna let this ride along the feather edge and see how it fits. Now, you have to recognize that in the end, this is paper. And it has its limits. Although we do fold it and ball it up and it is a little bit more flexible, it's not fabric, but you can kind of see how it's starting to take shape, right? And if I were to put a bit of tape around here on the bottom to hold it along that feather edge and really start to pull on this paper, you'll see that it's starting to align and take shape. Okay. So I think I'm happy with that. Now let's add our seam allowances and lasting allowances. And I already see a problem here. I didn't give myself enough room for the full lasting allowance. So do as I say, not as I do. So right here, we're gonna measure 10 millimeters for your seam allowances, right? So that's 10 for seam allowance, and then there's 5 millimeters for your folding allowance, right? And a folding allowance would be, say, let's say I did not want a raw edge along here, right? I could extend this up 5 millimeters, right? And then fold that over and either glue it in place or do a really close stitch along this edge, right? And it'll have a nice rolled edge, a nice clean finish, but I'm not gonna do that here. But if you wanted to do that, just remember that a folding allowance is 5 millimeters. It's half of your sewing allowance. And then we need to mark your lasting allowance, right? You know, your lasting allowance is the extra material on the bottom of your pattern that will allow you to wrap this around the bottom, okay? So everything we've done thus far ends on the feather edge, right? We want to give ourselves a bit extra so that we can wrap it around and underneath the last. And for that, I tend to do about 20 millimeters, right? If you want to give yourself a little extra, you can go 25 millimeters. So 20, 25 millimeters for your lasting allowance. Uh-oh. I'm gonna have to switch pencils here. All right, so my lasting allowance. Okay, I got a new pencil. I'm gonna start my drafting on this pattern, okay? So here's that seam allowance. Again, this design only has a single seam. That is called a hole cut. Many of you have patterns with multiple pieces. In theory, it's the same. You'll just have to design the seams where those different pieces, connect, right? So when doing so, in fact, for that reason, I'm gonna design a second seam here, just so I can give you an example of how to do that. So I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time making this pretty, but okay. Now we have a two-piece pattern, right? This is piece one, this is piece two. And in fact, because this is only half, it'll be a three-piece pattern. So you'll have 2 quarters and 1 vamp, right? I'm gonna do 20 millimeters Again, you can give yourself a little bit extra, but as you'll come to learn when lasting, um, having extra material in there can be a gift and a curse, right? Because one, it gives you a bit more to pull on, right? You can get a little bit more leverage when you're trying to stretch around the toe. But then you have to do something with that material. It could increase the possibility of getting pleats. And again, I didn't give myself enough room here. Make sure you do give yourself enough room when you're drafting your pattern. So if you have a foot that's larger than maybe a size 10, you may want to work on 11 by 17 sheets of paper rather than this legal size. But it's okay. It'll just be cut off at the toe, and in the end, I'll add a piece. Okay, so now we're going to extend our lines, sort of connect these dots. All right, so what do we do at these points here? So of course, because this is going to be one piece, you want to extend that design line to the edge of your lasting allowance. Okay. And then here, we need to figure out what part goes on top of the other. As far as this design goes, I think it would be better if the vamp sat on top of the quarters. Okay, so what does that seam look like? Well, again, I'm gonna have raw edges, so I don't need to worry about folding this edge over. We're using felt, so we don't have to worry about finishing the edge as you would with, let's say, canvas. So I'm not gonna make any changes to where this is, but I do need to have extra material here so that I can stitch on top of the quarter. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna extend that 1 millimeter, as I did in the back. Okay, so now we have our finish edge, and we have our seam allowance here shown as a dotted line. The next thing we're gonna do is I am going to begin cutting out little windows, is what I like to call them. There might be a technical name for it, but I'm not totally sure what that name is at the moment. I'll put it on the screen if I figure it out. But basically you cut these little windows so that when you're tracing this onto your material of choice, you can make marks for the sewing allowances, the seam allowances, the design lines, the lasting allowances, and you'll see what I'm talking about as I do this. So what I'm gonna do here, right, is I'm gonna draw or cut a slit. Goes from that point to the top here. Then I'm gonna cut a curvy line here. And then I will remove that. And of course, don't forget that this is folded over, so whatever you're cutting here is cutting through to the other side. Since our pattern is symmetrical, that is perfectly okay. All right? And then I'll do the same here. continue to do the same along this feather edge. Now I forgot to make a mark for this seam allowance here, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Okay, so there it is. I'm gonna open this up. And there's our pattern. So because we have multiple pieces, we'll use this to trace the actual pieces that we'll be using to actually create the pattern. Okay, so instead of using a tag board, which you should use, I am going to use paper just to sort of, not waste the tag board. So I'm going to begin to trace the pattern through these cutouts, right? So remember, these little ones are the seam allowance for the quarters. This bigger cutout is the cutout for the edge of the vamp here. And I'm also going to give myself a little extra room here so I can fix this this radius here that was cut off. Okay. And again, I know that I'm tracing the smooth side and not this weird sort of curvy side. Okay, so there you have it. That is your vamp. So I'm just gonna connect these points here. And of course you can fold this along the line and just cut one side. In fact, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna fold this. This is recycled paper, by the way. Okay. And then for the quarter here, because these two pieces are identical, you really only need one pattern piece. But you need to note on here that this is for both sides, right? Medial and lateral sides. It's sort of like a pattern piece for a sleeve, right? If the sleeves are identical, you don't need two pieces that are the same. So here, remember, we're tracing these set of lines for the seam allowance. And you can go ahead and draw the edge of the vamp there so that you can reference it in your pattern, right? So what I'll do here is I'll make more little windows. So that I can mark this on the material that I choose to use in the end. Okay, so that's one piece. Okay, so here we are, our two spinal pattern pieces, right? So you see we have our vamp here, and we have our little windows to trace our lasting allowance onto our final material. And we have the same here with our quarter. And again, this quarter represents the medial and lateral quarter. And then we have our little window here to show the edge of the vamp, right? So that lines up something like that. Okay. And then the lasting allowance and the seam allowance on the back. There you have it. There's your pattern.